Hey, what's up? Look at this. I meant to cover this a while back, but since there's no more comics industry, pretty much, I'm gonna go over the stuff I probably should have, the good stuff here. Wayne Van Zant, who I had covered before, probably one of the best comics history, military history guys there is. Now, I wanted to go over this in a different way than I usually do. I don't want to bring up too much historicism. I don't want to bring up my own, uh, biases or whatever, or how I think things should have gone. It doesn't make a difference. I'm biased. My mother's family were in the German military in the wars. Uh, my grandfather and my grandmother's cousin were the only men in the military, German military, to survive the war. Four others had perished, all facing the Red Army. So what I'm gonna try to do going with this is I'm gonna be like the tank nerd, like the World of Tanks, like the YouTube channel with that bleach blonde chick and the tall, I think he's Canadian or Irish or something guy, and the British guys at Bovington, real tank nerdy stuff. I'm gonna just pretty much go over that rather than everything else. All right. Right off the bat, we have probably one of my favorite armored vehicles, the very ugly but very effective Sturmgeschütz. One of those vehicles intended for something totally different, and then in the chaos of battle, proving itself to be quite adept at many other tasks. Big fan of the Sturmgeschütz. So you have a Sturmgeschütz right here. Michael Whitman, the infamous, the Tiger tank commander who took out 25 British tanks in literally like 20 minutes. A legend. And you have the other various Panzer aces and commanders of note. Some of them very young, and some of them guys from the First War. And it basically, the first graphic novel dealt with the invasion of Poland and the Blitzkrieg. This is, of course, dealing with the preparations for Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. And, here they are securing their positions. Okay. Oh, they want to take over the world. Well, it's a funny thing. If you don't secure a country that is next to you, the British attack you through it. So I try to explain that to some normie people I know when we talk about the war, but regardless. And here we have the great artwork from Van Zant, particularly the technical aspects of it. Just like Sam Glanzman was really good at drawing the tanks to specs, who, of course, Sam was an influence on Wayne. In fact, I can't wait to get my hands on the Willie Schultz collection, the Lonely War of Captain Willie Schultz, with Van Zant doing the last 20 pages because Sam passed on. But little aside, Panzer IIIs. This was the tank that the Germans had wanted to start the war with. And instead, they had the Panzer I's and the Panzer II, which is already kind of outdated, but I like the Panzer II for some reason. The transition between this tank and the Panzer I. There's something about this tank I like. They actually had a heavily armored version of this later, which they didn't make too many of them. It was kind of obsolete, like I said, but I always liked this tank. And so we're going to go on here. Of course, the old two front war thing. In the end, to think that these two regimes were not going to come to conflict is kind of naive. And when you're the country surrounded on both sides, or like if you're a guy surrounded on the street, you're gonna hit first if you want to have a chance of succeeding. I'll leave it at that. And there's the Panzer One. See the transition between that and the Panzer Three. And there's the Sturmgeschütz again. Now, you have here the Soviets had a lot of tanks. They had more tanks than anybody in the damn world and a larger army than anybody in the world. You have some of the hypotheses that they were planning to invade Europe. But all of it really doesn't make a difference. There's no point musing over things. That's what fiction is for. This is a historical narrative comic telling a story. And we have the invasion. Of course, Army Group South is of interest to me because my grandfather was in that attack wing of the invasion, going eventually all the way to the Caucasus, meeting the Muslims and the Cherkessans and people like that. Very interesting descriptions he gave to me of it, and he has some photos of The double-backed Bactrian furry camels that people used in that region. But what are these? These are the Czech 38Ts. Now, like I was saying, the Panzer's divisions they wanted the Panzer III to be the backbone, but they still had plenty of the ones and twos, which they had to use. So they annexing Czechoslovakia, they were able to get control of the Czech production of a tank that was probably better than any of the German Panzers at the time, the 38 and 35T. And we'll just go. I'm not going to go over the battles too much. The Germans outfought the Red Army to almost a ridiculous amount. So the victories that they had up until December were some of the biggest achievements of modern combat, I think, that ever probably occurred in history, to be honest with you. But to give the Russians, the Red Army, credit, many of the men were not trained well. Like here, I feel bad for the Russian tankers. They actually have, now this is the Russian tanks. The majority of them are these light tanks. But they have a medium tank here, the T-34, and the KV-1 heavy tank. These were actually decent tanks, where most of the tanks were these BT-7s and whatnot. But you can imagine the Red Army, between the bullying of the commissars and in general, these men were not trained hardly at all and then thrown into combat. So the effectiveness of these tanks, especially the T-34, which had a really cramped turret, they were not as effective even with these superior weapons. And the combined arms fighting. The Panzer III, though, could not deal with the T-34 head-to-head. Hence the flanking, the superior flanking and coordination was very important to defeat these heavily armed and armored tanks. And you always had this sucker, the 88, and you also had another vehicle, which I'll focus on, the Sturmgeschütz. Now, what is this? And there's Michael Whitman. He knocked out in one battle 6 enemy tanks, including the T-34s. With this, this is an artillery. This is what they call a assault gun. This was meant to support infantry, to attack fortifications. So it had a little more armor than the Panzer III, and it had a short velocity cannon, which was still effective though against the heavier Russian tanks. The Panzer III had a 37 millimeter or 50 millimeter cannon, which could not penetrate the sloped armor of the T-34. But the Sturmgeschütz had a degree of success against them. So it was originally an assault gun manned by artillerymen. The artillerymen were trained differently than the Panzer gunners, and arguably with a better method. These things they're low to the ground, they're cheaper to build. They replaced that with a high-velocity anti-tank 75 millimeter, and from the beginning to the end, these Sturmgeschützes accounted for more destroyed Soviet and Allied vehicles than any other unit. Not just because of there were more of them than any other vehicle produced by the Germans, but the nature of the combat that these things had. One of my favorite vehicles. And of course, the combined arms fighting of the Germans with radios, with trainings. A lot of the Soviets didn't have that. They ground them up regardless. And I'm not going to go over too much individual things here. The Red Army, the Russian soldiers, a lot of them surrendered, but a lot of them fought to the death. They fought damn hard. You have to feel for these guys. Their place is getting attacked regardless of what I think of the Soviet Union. And they're fighting. And the ones who aren't annihilated in the pockets, because the Germans would scissor. They would flank their enemies and then trap armies in between them and then grind them up. And the ones who escaped were not rewarded. They were in penal battalions, a lot of them. What the hell are you supposed to do? You're not even technically believing in any higher power other than the Soviet Union. Why would you fight to the death? Well, because the Russians were tough. And of course, the POWs here, and a lot of Russian prisoners did starve to death. You could say there was malevolence on that part. I'm not going to make any excuses for that, but I will say that never forget that the many German POWs early on in this campaign who were taken because they were overextended were found executed, and executed not pleasantly. So the Germans quickly learned to not really give a damn about the enemy they were fighting, which I don't condone actually, but whatever. We're beyond good and evil, right? Here we got KB1s coming in, and another thing is the Panzerjägers, the anti-tank units of the Germans, were unable to stop these heavy tanks. Okay, all they had were 37 millimeter cannons. They were not able to do their function. So many of these KV-1s were taken out by the infantry, okay, using mines, using improvised explosives, and just sheer guts. Okay, so the Panzercracker medal was created because you had infantry guys taking out these heavy tanks, which means you had to get close to them. Yep. Panzerjäger to the front, see? T-34s, which they can't stop. Eventually, the Panzerjägers got self-propelled the Martyr series. And then they were able to do their job, which, they were unable to do with a cannon like that. It wasn't going to stop the T-34s. And the Martyrs, of course, were very effective vehicles also. So, going through here, the sheer distance of the Soviet Union. These guys are marching for months, and they're trying to get to Moscow, okay? Taking Moscow is a big thing, and the resistance got more. I mean, the Russians, the Red Army, the Russian fighting spirit, we don't have to mention. And they start using stuff like this scene with the dog. Hey, what's that on its back? All right, now we shoot every dog we see. It's kind of funny, I remember when the invasion of Iraq and the occupation, when I remember how underhanded and evil the insurgents were for using IEDs that were effective. The Germans at least expected the Soviets to fight them. Apparently, American neoconservative analysts, they never seemed, or the military, they never seemed to figure that people would actually fight them. Very strange. All right, so now, as you say, they're fighting, and the Russians, I mean, those machine guns were pretty good. I mean, these guys fought very, very hard. And so, what is this? Oh, it's starting to rain. It's October, and they're trying to get to Moscow. But it's starting to rain. It's starting to get a little chilly out. Anyway, and there's the other cool Sturmgeschütz. You see how low that is? It's hard to hit it. And you got the Russian people, the masses of people trying to help their motherland, trying to defend their motherland, men and women. I don't like any of this, by the way. This is all tragic. Anyway, and you got these giant Russian tanks based on the British tank, the Independent, which is at Bovington. These things looked really cool in the 30s, and they were next to useless in combat. Very mechanically unreliable, and the armored sides were not that armored, so flanking maneuvers pretty much took these out. I'm doing this one-handed. I'm trying to get to here. Now the guys are looking tired. They're losing guys, and it's starting to get cold and muddy. And you still have amazing combat feats from the Germans, literally annihilating Soviet armies regardless of what was thrown at them. Like here, like this sums it up. My God, can there be any Russians left? There's the KV-2. Okay, which was even more heavily armored, but it's not what weapons you have, it's how you use them. Okay, and of course the 88s could fill in the gaps and just wreck these things. But what's this? Oh boy, here comes winter, and now you start to see the things bogged down as the Red Army, as the Russian fighting man is going all out. Okay, friggin' dying in droves to stop the Germans, which is what men do. Okay, and there's an interesting technical point here as I get to the end. The scene here where the German precision weapons are now having problems with the 40 below zero temperatures. And the Russians, and you start to see more inhabitants of the Soviet Union that are not Russians being employed. Sunflower oil, simple things like that. Turning the tanks over with compressed air. The Russians are more suited for this ice, this temperature, where the Germans are starting to suffer with their fine engineering, and they're starting to freeze their asses off. Well, logistics is as much a thing. And the end here, I'll just get to it real quick. They're almost at the gates of Moscow. They're so close, but they're overextended. And then you get stuff like this, 70 T-34 tanks with loads behind them coming. The battle in the Eastern Front was just beginning. and the destruction of our civilization was just beginning. But anyway, there you go. Wayne Van Zant, get his stuff. He's great. Later.